This video walks you through two examples for counterexample construction. Now, the counterexample method is just a way of showing that an argument is invalid, that the reasoning used in a given argument is bad. And it does that because when we construct a substitution instance of a given argument, we are reusing the exact same reasoning that the original argument uses, but we are inferring from obviously true premises to an obviously false conclusion. And if we're able to do that with the exact same reasoning as the original argument, then we've shown that the reasoning is bad, that the reasoning fails to be truth preserving. Now, this video is focusing on the construction of counterexamples, so that's all I'm going to say about what a counterexample is and how they work. Make sure that you follow up on the DBs with me if you have any questions. So let's take a look at our first example. Now, here's an argument, and at first glance, someone might even be tricked into thinking that the argument is a good one. After all, both the premises are true, and the conclusion's also true. Some elected politicians are not honest. But the thing is, on closer examination, we'll see that the reasoning used in this argument is actually invalid or bad. And so how do we go about doing that? The first thing is to use good reading comprehension to try to figure out what that reasoning is. And a concrete tip about how to read for the reasoning is to look for repeated sentences, clauses, or categories and leave everything else behind. Okay. And so what does that look like in this case? So here's a repeated phrase, public figures. It shows up twice in the argument, and I've got it highlighted in yellow just to indicate that it's that same phrase, public figures, that's being repeated twice, once in the first premise and once in the second premise. And here's another repeated phrase, elected politicians. Now, I've used a different color here to highlight it because it is a new repeated phrase, and I want to remind myself that it's a different phrase than public figures. Color coding is not a necessary part of the counterexample method, but it is very useful, and I do highly recommend it, especially in the beginning or if you are having any trouble figuring out how to follow the substitution instances and find your counterexample. And here's a third repeated phrase, honest people and honest. And now you might be going, wait a minute, those are not exactly repeats of each other. Why do we get to treat them as repeats? And in general, do be very careful about how you're reading and what you're reading. Not all similar terms are genuinely synonymous. But when you simply have different expressions for exactly the same thing, then you can count a phrase as a repeat of each other. In fact, here, all you've got is what's called elliptical construction, right? English grammar allows us to drop words when we can say the exact same thing with fewer words, and that's all that's happening here. And so honest people and honest really are just two expressions of the same thing. In any case, what we've got when we identify and then remove those repeated phrases is the argument's form. That is its reasoning pattern. Now, how is this a reasoning pattern? Well, think about it this way. That first premise is really just establishing a relationship between the blue things or the first things and those yellow things or the second things. Some of the blue things are not the yellow things. The second premise is saying that there's these third things, these green things, and all of them are those second or yellow things. And then on the basis of those two relationships, the argument anyway claims that we can conclude that those third things are related to those first things in a certain way. That is, that some of those third things are not those blue things. Now, going back to the counterexample method, we need to start filling in that form with our substitutions in order to make our counterexample. Now, choose really simple terms and phrases, something like cats. It's a little boring, but in producing a counterexample, it's really important that the premises turn out to be indisputably true in the actual world, and the conclusion indisputably false. So simple terms like cats or mammals, stuff like that, It's convenient for this purpose because it's easy to make indisputably true or false sentences with those sorts of simple terms. In addition, always make sure that your substitutions are being made uniformly. That is, in my color coding case, this means that cats gets filled in everywhere there is a green blank, and also only where there are green blanks. And then the next step is to keep doing what we were just doing, but with the other blanks. Now, in the handout, I recommend starting with an obviously false conclusion and then sort of working your way through trial and error to true premises. The textbook recommends starting with true premises, then working your way to a false conclusion. Do some experimenting, see what the argument's giving you. Here, I do think a false conclusion is very easy. For example, some cats are not animals is clearly false. And then I make sure my substitutions are made uniformly. And so since I'm using animals in the blue spots, I've got to type in or write in animals in the first premise. And then we keep going, and now it's the yellow terms that we're trying to replace, and maybe I try rocks. Some animals are not rocks is definitely true, and so maybe that will work. But when I finish making my substitutions, because I have to make them uniformly, then I run into a problem. Some animals are not rocks is true, but all cats are rocks is false. And for a counterexample, what I need is true premises and a false conclusion. Well, no big deal. I just try again. And maybe this time I try mammals. Some animals are not mammals. That's true. Frogs are not mammals, for example. And then I finish making my substitutions uniformly, so mammals goes in the last yellow spot. And I get another true premise. All cats are mammals. And so then what I have now is a counterexample. It's an argument that uses the exact same form as the original argument, but with indisputably true premises and a false conclusion, thus showing that the reasoning that supposedly gets us from the evidence to the conclusion is bad or invalid. Here's our second example, and in this one we'll need to be substituting out longer phrases, entire sentences in fact. And there are some things to watch out for, especially relating to negative particles, which we'll see, but I'll still go through this one a little bit faster just because the process is the same. And it starts out with figuring out what that argument's reasoning form is. And we do that by looking for repeated phrases or terms or sentences. And here, notice that the price of automobiles will rise is a phrase that gets repeated in the first premise and then also the conclusion. But notice that when it shows up at the conclusion, it's broken up by a negative particle. It's the same thing with our other repeated phrase as well. The government imposes import restrictions occurs in both the first premise as well as the second one, but in the second one, it's broken up with a negative particle. Now, what that leaves us with is an argument form that looks something like this. And what can sometimes throw people off, at least in the beginning, is the way that these repeated phrases, say the blue phrase, gets broken up. You know, how is that exactly a repeat? And this is, again, a function of grammar and ordinary language allowing us to do things like cut up a phrase with a negation. What's really going on in this argument is just a bit of conditional reasoning. If the first thing happens, then the second thing happens. The first thing isn't happening, right? But English grammar lets us usually express that with a not inside of that phrase. And the conclusion, of course, then is really just, and therefore the second thing isn't happening. And then the next step is to start filling in that argument form with new terms or sentences, in this case, so that you can eventually make all true premises and a false conclusion. And this time for the blue phrase, I've chosen Chris Hemsworth has a sister. And notice again with that second premise, the more natural way of expressing that sentence in ordinary language is to say Chris Hemsworth does not have a sister. And of course, that more closely parallels the expressions used in the original argument. And then we continue this process of finding these substitutions. And so now we're focused on the yellow bit, and I've chosen Chris Hemsworth as a sibling because that does make this first sentence true. If Chris Hemsworth has a sister, then he is a sibling. And of course, we have to make sure replacements are uniform, and so I repeat that Chris Hemsworth is a sibling in the yellow part of the conclusion. And of course, we notice again that the more ordinary way of expressing that is just to say, well, Chris Hemsworth is not a sibling, and that more closely matches the original target argument anyway. So where does this leave us? Well, we started with an argument. We maybe weren't sure if it was good or bad, but either way, we wanted some proof that it was bad. So then we constructed a parallel argument that uses the exact same reasoning pattern that has indisputably true premises. If Hemsworth were a sister, he would have a sibling. Hemsworth does not have any sisters, he just has brothers. But because he does have brothers, the conclusion is indisputably false. And so we've shown then that using the reasoning in the original argument, we can move from true premises to a false conclusion, and that means that the reasoning in the original argument is bad as well.